The courtroom was too cold for spring. Naomi Carter sat at the edge of a long mahogany table, her hands resting stiffly in her lap, one finger nervously grazing the ridged spine of her black leather pen. The windows frosted and tall in light that felt more like obligation than warmth. A thin film of dust floated between her and Marcus Reed, the man who once promised her forever. And now, he couldn't even offer a glance. His head was bowed, fingers flying over his phone screen, responding to emails or text messages, or maybe nothing at all. Naomi didn't know. She had stopped being curious months ago, back when his silence stopped feeling like a pause and started feeling like a verdict. Their lawyers spoke in hushed voices at either end of the table, passing folders and pointing at lines. But everything around her blurred into something weightless, detached, unmoored. She was here to sign her freedom, and somehow, it still felt like surrender. Naomi's heart thudded against her ribcage, not loud enough for the room to hear, but loud enough to drown out her thoughts. Her eyes flicked downward, scanning the page, the decree of dissolution, the breakdown of assets, the part where her last name still sat beside his. A name she'd once been proud to carry, now burned like ash on the paper. Her pen trembled in her grip. Across the table, Marcus yawned. She thought about the first time he kissed her outside the Columbia Library in the rain, his hoodie draped over her shoulders. She remembered the way his hands shook when he met her mother for the first time. And she remembered, perhaps most painfully, the late-night conversations in bed when their hearts beat against each other, and he promised, "You'll never carry anything alone." But now, she was alone. She signed anyway. The scratch of a pen on paper was louder than it should have been, almost vulgar in the quiet room. Naomi Carter. Her name bled into the document like it no longer belonged to her. She stared at it for a beat too long, as though the ink might still reconsider, as though this moment might rewind. But it didn't. The lawyer nodded. Marcus glanced up wantonly to check the time, then returned to whatever insignificant glow his screen offered. He didn't speak, didn't say thank you, didn't even say goodbye. Naomi stood, or rather, she tried to. Her knees gave slightly beneath her. She placed a hand on the table's edge for support, but the room tilted like a ship in a storm. Her breath shortened, came too quickly, then too shallow. Her heart, that faithful organ, suddenly seemed unsure of its rhythm. She took one step, then another. Her heels echoed unevenly down the hallway as she made her way out, vision tunneling. The walls shimmered. Her hands clutched her coat. A sharp throb stabbed behind her eyes, and her body began to sway. And then there was nothing. She collapsed silently onto the marble floor, like a petal falling from a stem that had held on too long. Her purse spilled beside her. Lip balm. An old receipt. A paperback with a bent cover. The air filled with gasps. Someone screamed. A clerk ran. A security guard rushed over, shouting her name after checking her ID. But Naomi heard none of it. Because Naomi was somewhere else. Somewhere deep inside a heart that had finally said, enough. Ethan Callahan stood frozen across the hallway, dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit. He hadn't come for her. He didn't even know her name. He was there for a legal mediation involving his cousin routine. Forgettable. But what he witnessed was anything but ordinary. He didn't know why he couldn't look away. Maybe it was the way she fell to the floor without a sound. Perhaps the photo slipped from her bagger, and a man, once smiling, now faded. Or maybe it was something else. Something in the air between her stillness and the cold fluorescence above. A presence. A story he wasn't part of, yet couldn't walk past. Ethan watched as the medics arrived, watched as they lifted her carefully onto the stretcher. Her hand dangled loosely off the side, ring finger bare. Her hair, rich and textured, fanned out against the stretcher like ink on linen. And though she didn't move, something about her silence, her absence, felt louder than the sirens screaming outside. He wasn't supposed to care, but he did. That could be how stories began. Not with thunder, but with the quiet ache of recognition. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever known what it means to lose your voice and still dare to rise, I'd love to hear your thoughts below. Leave a comment, share your heart, or follow this channel for the rest of Naomi's journey. Because some stories don't just entertain, they remind us we're not alone. To be continued in Part 2. The night had fallen by the time Ethan Callahan finally left the courthouse. But it wasn't the case that kept him. It was her. He didn't know her name, not yet. But the image of the woman collapsing to the floor, slow, soundless, as though she had finally let go of something she'd been holding, for too long clung to him like damp air. She had looked composed moments before. Not broken, not frantic. Composed in the way a bridge looks sturdy just before it crumbles. And when she crumbled, something in him reacted, viscerally, unexpectedly. He had told his assistant he wouldn't be late and would be in and out. But now, as he stood outside the hospital, watching ambulance lights fade into the distance, time had lost its edge. The sharp corners of his day dulled. His meetings, his calls, his schedule. They didn't matter, because the woman who fell hadn't left his mind. Back inside the hospital, sterile lights buzzed above like dull stars. Nurses moved with quiet urgency, and machines hummed softly in every corner. Ethan hadn't followed the ambulance directly. That would have made it too real, too much. Instead, he walked, slowly, without explanation, until somehow his feet had led him here. The nurse at the ICU desk glanced at him, her brow furrowed. "Family?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. He could have lied, but he shook his head. "No, I saw her fall." Something in his voice must have softened her suspicion, because she didn't push further. She only nodded and motioned toward the chairs near the glass wall, where, beyond it, the ICU stretched like a sanctuary cloaked in silence. He sat, and there she was. The same woman's skin now, a delicate contrast to the white hospital sheets. Her curls spread like ink on snow, her hand resting motionless by her side. Monitors blinked softly at her bedside. She looked smaller now, fragile even, but not gone, not empty. There was still something in the way her chest rose and fell that suggested endurance. Even unconscious, she seemed to be fighting something only she could see. Ethan leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on her through the glass. He didn't question why he stayed. He didn't let himself give it words. All he knew was that it mattered, that she mattered even if he didn't understand how or why. She reminded him of someone, not in appearance, not even in voice he hadn't heard her speak, but in the presence, in the quiet weight she carried. Years ago, he had watched his mother sit at the edge of a hospital bed in silence for hours, waiting and hoping and refusing to cry. He had been 15, still too young to know how to help, too old to believe it wasn't his job. The woman in this bed wore that same kind of exhaustion, the kind that didn't beg for rescue, only rest. A nurse passed by and placed a chart on the desk. She glanced at the glass, then at Ethan. "She's stable," she said gently, her tone between professional and compassionate. It was a collapse from severe stress. Her body gave out. Not uncommon, but dangerous if ignored. Ethan nodded faintly. She'll be moved to a private recovery room once she wakes. And then the nurse moved on, leaving him alone again with her, and with a silence that didn't feel empty. The hours folded into each other. Staff rotated. Shadows shifted. No one asked him to leave. Outside the glass, the woman didn't stir. But Ethan watched every breath she took like it was a line of poetry. Fragile, unfinished, beautiful in its uncertainty. He studied her face, not with curiosity, but with reverence. The soft curve of her cheek, the faint freckles near her jawline. The tension was still visible at the corners of her mouth, even in sleep. There was something sacred about watching someone when they didn't know they were being seen. He wasn't supposed to be here. His company, Callahan Publishing, was reviewing 3 new authors. He had meetings lined up, one with an international partner, another with the board. His phone had buzzed 12 times before he silenced it and flipped it face down beside him. It didn't matter, because something inside him whispered that this moment, quiet and inexplicable, meant more than any call ever could. Later, a young nurse approached with a paper cup of coffee and a gentle smile. "For you," she said. "You've been here a while." Ethan accepted it with a slight nod. "Thank you." "She's strong," the nurse added. "Whatever she's been through, you can tell." Her pulse kept spiking and settling again, like her body was trying to wake before it was ready, like she didn't want to leave. He held the cup between his palms, letting the warmth seep into his hands. The nurse returned to her station, leaving only her words and the soft scent of lavender that followed her. Ethan took a slow sip. Bitterness bloomed across his tongue, but it grounded him. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But he knew deeply, quietly, that it wasn't finished, that this wasn't a period, but a pause. That something had cracked, yes, but there was a chapter still waiting to be written. So he stayed, and just before dawn, he pulled a blank card from the pocket of his coat, the kind he used for authors when sending quiet congratulations. On the back, he wrote just one line: "Rest. You're stronger than you know." He slipped it through the crack in the glass door to the nurse inside. "Can you leave this by her bed?" he asked softly. The nurse looked at the card, then at him, and she nodded. "I will." Then Ethan turned, not because he wanted to leave, but because something in him trusted she would wake. And when she did, he hoped the first thing she saw was a sentence that didn't ask her to be anything more than she already was. Alive, still here, and stronger than she realized. The world returned to her not in a rush, but in fragments. Naomi Carter became aware first of breath, a slow, deliberate rhythm pressing up from her chest like waves lapping against the shore after a storm. In, out, in, out, as if her body was relearning what it meant to stay. Then came sound, the faint beep of a monitor, a soft hiss of oxygen, the low murmur of voices outside a closed door. Her fingers twitched against something smooth and cool, but not unfamiliar. Paper. A card. Something tucked into the curve of her palm, like it had been placed there with care. She opened her eyes slowly. The ceiling above her was flat, white, and sterile. Her body felt heavy, as if filled with damp sand. Her throat was dry and sore. She blinked again, trying to gather her bearings. The scent of antiseptic was sharp, but beneath it lingered something gentler. Lavender, perhaps. Faint and soothing, like a memory too soft to hold. It took her a moment longer to realize she was in a hospital, another moment to remember why. And then it came back, not like a scream, but a slow, sinking wave. The courtroom, the paperwork, The pen. Marcus's indifference. Her signature. The breath she didn't finish taking. And the collapse. She didn't remember falling. Only the sensation of letting go. Turning her head, Naomi caught sight of a small vase on the side table. Carefully arranged wildflowers leaned toward the light filtering from the narrow window. And beneath them, just at the edge of the pillow, was a folded card. She looked down. The same card was still in her hand. Unfolding it slowly, she read the words, 7 of them, handwritten in clean, slanted script. Rest. You're stronger than you know. Her lips parted, though no sound escaped. She reread it, eyes scanning for a name. There was none, just the sentence, simple, deliberate, and almost impossibly gentle. Someone had seen her, not as a patient, not as a case, but as a person still fighting, even when her body had given out. She stared at the handwriting as though it held some clue to the soul behind it. But all it offered was silence. A silence that, strangely, didn't feel empty. The door opened quietly. A doctor stepped inside, tall, silver-haired, his face lined but kind. He approached without hurry, glancing from her monitors to her eyes with practiced warmth. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and even, like someone who had said the exact phrase 1,000 times but still meant it every time. "You gave us a bit of a scare." Naomi tried to speak. Nothing came out. The doctor raised a hand gently. "Don't rush it. You've been unconscious for several hours. Your body's been through more than you realize." She nodded faintly. He pulled up a chair and sat beside her bed, the paper on his clipboard rustling as he flipped to a fresh page. "We've run some tests," he began, "and I want to explain them to you, slowly. You had what we call stress-induced cardiomyopathy, also known as broken heart syndrome. It's genuine, and it's not uncommon in patients who've experienced prolonged emotional trauma." She blinked, trying to digest the words. Her fingers gripped the edge of the blanket. "It mimics a heart attack," he continued. "Your EKG was abnormal. Your blood pressure dropped. But there's no blockage, no long-term damage. Your nervous system collapsed, your body's way of saying it couldn't carry what your heart wouldn't name." Naomi looked away, eyes fixed on a small crack in the ceiling. Her throat worked to swallow, but her chest felt thick. Not with pain exactly, but with a kind of weight she'd forgotten to notice. "I thought I was just tired," she whispered. "You were," he said gently, "but not the kind a nap can fix." When the doctor left, the silence settled in again. But it was different now, less sterile, more contemplative. Naomi closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words. "You've been strong for too long." And maybe, she thought, strength wasn't the badge she once believed it to be. Perhaps it was a burden, something you carried until it broke you. And in that breaking, maybe you finally learned where the cracks had been. The door opened again, this time without the hush of professionalism. There was a pause, and then the sound of a hesitant breath. Naomi turned her head. He stood in the doorway like he didn't mean to stay, like his presence was accidental, even though it wasn't. His hair was slightly tousled, his coat gone, just a sweater over crisp slacks. He looked out of place, like someone sitting too long and overthinking. She stared at him for a moment, and he stared back. "You were there," she said hoarsely, "when I collapsed." He nodded. "I was." And this, she held up the card, her fingers curling around it. "That was me," he said softly. She studied him, not suspiciously, but carefully, as if trying to locate the exact moment his path had crossed hers, as if some part of her had already known he was watching. "Why?" she asked. He stepped closer, but kept his distance, hands in his pockets, posture open but cautious. "Because someone should have seen you before you fell," he said quietly. "And when no one did, I couldn't walk away." Naomi blinked. His words didn't rush in like apologies. They settled into the room like warmth, like shelter. She looked at the card in her hand, which she'd gripped even in sleep, and her chest loosened for the first time in weeks, maybe months. Not healed, not whole. But something inside her shifted, not because of who he was, but because he hadn't spoken to her like a woman who needed saving. He spoke like someone who believed she was already worth noticing, and in a life filled with silence. That was its kind of salvation. Naomi hadn't expected him to return. After that first quiet exchange in the hospital room, a few words, a shared breath, a glance that lingered longer than it should have, she assumed it was a moment sealed in time, fleeting, and almost too gentle to be real. Something unspoken had passed between them. Yes. But people like him, men who wore tailored restraint like a second skin, didn't linger in the wake of strangers. And yet, 3 days later, he appeared again. It was raining outside, soft and slow, the kind of rain that felt less like weather and more like permission to feel whatever you'd been avoiding. Naomi sat upright in her hospital bed, a book resting unopened on her lap, her eyes trailing the way raindrops meandered down the window pane like indecisive thoughts. The door creaked. She didn't turn her head right away. There was something delicate about his presence, unforced, unannounced, like he didn't want to disturb a space that had finally grown quiet. "I brought something," Ethan said, his voice low and warm. Naomi looked over. He held a small bouquet in one hand, nothing extravagant. Just a few sprigs of lavender, some chamomile, and a cluster of deep blue cornflowers. The kind of bouquet that looked hand-picked, not arranged. "For your room," he added. "It smelled like nothing in here." Naomi smiled faintly. "Hospitals aren't built for comfort." "No," he agreed. "They're built for repair." He walked to the side table and placed the flowers in a chipped glass, holding her ginger ale. It wasn't graceful. The flowers tilted unevenly. But somehow, that made it better. "Thank you," she said softly. He shrugged, then sat in the same chair he had the other night, one hand resting on his knee, the other on the armrest, as though anchoring himself in a place he wasn't sure he could be. They didn't speak for a while. Outside, the rain deepened, tapping softly against the window. Nurses passed in the hallway. A machine near the bed beeped once, then fell quiet. "Did you know," Ethan said after a while, "that cornflowers were once worn by men who'd fallen in love but hadn't said it yet?" Naomi turned to him, one brow lifting. He smiled, just a flicker. Victorian flower language. If the flower faded too soon, the love wouldn't return. "Sounds dramatic," she murmured. "Maybe. But most honest things are." She looked at him for a long moment, unsure what to make of this man who said very little, yet seemed to speak straight into her bones. He didn't flirt. He didn't tiptoe around her pain. He just showed up, quietly, like someone who didn't expect anything but stayed anyway. "Do you habitually visit strangers in hospitals?" she asked, her voice a little lighter. His lips quirked. "Only the ones who collapse in courtrooms with too much grace." She huffed a soft laugh, then looked away. Her eyes fell on the card again, which she kept tucked beside her pillow. She hadn't told anyone about it. Not the nurses, not her friend Nia, who had texted daily. But somehow, it remained there, untouched and comforting. "You didn't have to come back," she said after a moment. "I know, but you did." He nodded once. "You seemed like the kind of person who's been alone in a room too many times." She blinked, surprised by the accuracy of that observation, by how easily he carved truth from her silence. And that was what made it feel safe. Ethan didn't press her for her story. He didn't ask why she was there, or what had brought her to the edge of exhaustion. He didn't dissect her diagnosis or measure her worth through the lens of pity. He sat with her, and that, she realized, was its intimacy, the kind that asked for nothing but presence. An hour passed, maybe more. He stood eventually, checked his watch, then looked at her like he wanted to say something, but knew words would only flatten it. She beat him to it. "I used to write," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Essays, reflections, sometimes stories. I had a small blog. Before everything." He didn't interrupt, just waited. "I stopped when I got married," she added, her fingers plucking at the edge of her blanket. It wasn't forbidden, just inconvenient. There was no bitterness in her voice, only the slow unraveling of a truth she hadn't said aloud in a long time. Ethan's gaze didn't flicker. "Was it good?" She blinked. "The writing?" He nodded. She shrugged. "I think so." "Well," he said, "I'd like to read it sometime." Naomi tilted her head. "You don't even know my last name." He gave her a soft look. "I will." Later that evening, after he left, Naomi stared at the flowers. The room didn't smell like bleach anymore. It smelled like lavender and was quiet, like rain, and something unfamiliar blooming in her chest. She didn't know what to call it, but it didn't need a name. Not yet. It was 2 days after she was discharged when Naomi found the envelope. At first, she hadn't noticed it, just another cream-colored square tucked beneath the latest pharmacy bag and a modest stack of unopened bills. Her dim and hushed apartment smelled like lemon cleaner and wilted determination. She hadn't yet lit a candle or opened the blinds. She hadn't needed to. The quiet felt necessary. But the envelope stopped her. Her name was written across the front in deep navy ink, not printed on. Written, carefully, purposefully. The kind of writing that suggested the person had paused before every stroke. She sat on the edge of the couch and opened it. Inside, a single card, unlined and unadorned, except for a logo she recognized faintly in the bottom right corner. Callahan Publishing. Gold embossed. Understated. Elegant. Just like him. The note was handwritten too. "Naomi, I remember something you said in the hospital. You used to write, edit, and tell stories before you were told they weren't necessary. You're building something again that needs eyes and hands like yours. We're not offering pity. We're offering space. And trust. It's freelance to start. Flexible. Quiet. You don't owe an answer. But if returning to words doesn't feel like a burden, I hope you'll consider it. Ethan." She read it 3 times before setting it down. There was no timeline, no request, no echo of expectation, just possibility. That night, Naomi stood in the kitchen barefoot, her fingers wrapped around a chipped mug of tea she hadn't finished. The bouquet from the hospital, now drooping slightly, rested on the windowsill, leaning toward what little light the city sky allowed. She hadn't touched her old laptop in months. It sat quietly under the bookshelf, battery drained, dust gathering along its edges like shame. The last document she had opened was a story, half finished, a woman waiting at a bus stop in the rain, unsure if the person she loved would return. Naomi hadn't known how to end it. She still didn't. But that night, she bent down, lifted the laptop, and plugged it in. The screen came to life slowly, as if remembering how to breathe. Password, desktop, files. Familiarity wrapped around her like a loose cardigan, comforting but not warm yet. She opened the document. Then, I closed it. Instead, she opened a blank page, and began. Not with a plot, not even with a purpose, just a sentence, then another. And for the first time in a long time, Naomi didn't feel like she was trying to prove something. She wasn't writing to be published. She wasn't created to be seen. She was returning to herself. The next morning she sent a reply. Not an essay, just one line. I want to try. A week passed, then two. The first email came from a managing editor named Clara Warm. Direct, efficient. Naomi was added to the freelancer database. She was sent a submission to review. A debut novel, full of potential but rough at the seams. The kind of manuscript that needed someone who understood emotional pacing, not just grammar. As she worked through the pages, marking notes, reshaping structure, trimming dialogue, Naomi felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to think in years. Belonging. Not to a man, not to a title, to a craft. Her hands remembered. Her intuition remembered. Though still bruised, her heart began to beat alongside paragraphs and pacing. She returned the edit 3 days early. The feedback from Clara was short but sincere. You have a rare touch. You made the writer sound more like herself. Naomi stared at that line for a long time, because that was what she had been missing. Not just a place to put her skill, but a place where her presence made others more themselves too. She didn't see Ethan during those first weeks. He didn't call, didn't text, didn't send flowers or follow up with polite inquiries. And somehow, that absence felt like the most respectful presence of all. He hadn't extended a hand, expecting hers in return. He had opened a door and waited. The first time she saw him again, it was unplanned. She had just finished a morning meeting with Clara and stopped by the publisher's downtown office to pick up a printed copy of the manuscript for her records. The building was modern, but welcoming glass walls, softened with warm wood accents, and overflowing bookshelves lining the corridors. Naomi stood by the front desk, waiting for the assistant to return, when she heard his voice from down the hall. Not loud, not commanding, but unmistakably his. It was how his tone dipped slightly at the end of each sentence, the calm cadence of someone who didn't need volume to be heard. She didn't turn right away, but he saw her. Their eyes met. And in that brief moment, across a polished floor and a hallway lined with framed author portraits, he didn't smile like a man who'd planned it. He acknowledged her with a gaze that said, "I'm glad you're here." She nodded once. It was enough. That night, Naomi walked home through the city with the manuscript tucked under her arm, her coat catching the early wind of spring. She didn't rush. She let herself notice things the way people passed in hurried clusters, how the sun spilled across glass buildings, how her feet didn't ache the way they used to. When she arrived home, she placed the manuscript on her kitchen table and lit a candle, the same lavender she'd bought months ago and never touched. She sat in the quiet and wrote again. Not for a deadline, not for approval, to feel her voice return. And beneath her tea mug sat Ethan's card, still uncreased, still simple. She didn't need to read it anymore. She remembered every word. Friday evenings in the city always carried a strange hush, like the week had exhaled and everyone was catching their breath in cafes, bar stools, and slow-moving elevators. For Naomi, the hush wasn't just in the streets. It settled somewhere inside her, between her ribs, like space that had finally opened up. She stayed late at the office that day, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The quiet invited attention, the soft rhythm of keyboards, a few lingering voices behind glass-walled offices, the gentle hum of the espresso machine from down the hall. Naomi had spent the last 2 hours editing a memoir that read more like a letter to an unloved self. It was messy and raw, full of run-ons and unfiltered pain. But Naomi understood the tremor in its sentences. She cleaned its edges with compassion, not correction. By the time she looked up, the floor was almost empty. Sunset had dipped behind the skyline, and the windows now reflected the office more than the city. She gathered her things slowly, slipped the marked manuscript into her tote, and looped her scarf around her neck with the care she never used to give herself. She didn't expect him to be there, but as she stepped out into the elevator lobby, she saw him. Ethan, standing near the large windows at the end of the hall, phone in one hand, a takeaway coffee in the other, gazing out over the dusky sprawl of buildings like someone watching a city exhale. She didn't mean to hesitate, but she did. Something about how he stood, the stillness, the sharp lines of his profile softened by evening light, made her pause. She wasn't sure if she should say something, or keep walking, or disappear altogether. He turned before she made up her mind. His eyes met hers across the stretch of hallway. "Working late?" he asked, a quiet smile pulling at his mouth. "Guilty," she replied, stepping closer. "You?" He lifted the coffee slightly, then shrugged. "Sometimes it's easier to think when the building forgets to be busy." She nodded. She understood that kind of thinking, the type that preferred silence over strategy. They stood by the window momentarily, facing the glass, the city glowing beneath them in soft halos of gold and blue. The rain had stopped, but the streets below still shimmered, reflective and moody. Naomi glanced sideways. "You don't strike me as someone who forgets how to slow down." He looked at her. "And you don't strike me as someone who doubts herself." The words landed with a quiet weight. She let them settle. "I used to," she said softly. "And now?" She exhaled. "Now I'm somewhere in between." There was no pity in his gaze, no correction, just presence. "I think that's where most of us live," he said. She turned to face him more directly then, leaning slightly against the window ledge, her fingers brushing the seam of her coat. "Why did you ask me to work with Callahan?" His expression didn't shift. "Because you see what people are trying to say, not just what they wrote," he said. "And because your silence speaks louder than some people's noise." Naomi held his gaze. It wasn't the compliment that moved. It was how he said it. Without performance, without expectation, like he wasn't trying to impress her, reflect her to herself. Their eyes lingered, not in flirtation, in recognition. A pause filled the air, not tense, not awkward, just spacious. And then, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. He took a step closer. Not enough to invade, just enough to be near. Naomi's breath slowed. There was something unspoken dancing at the edge of the momentum ache, perhaps, or the beginning of a tenderness that hadn't yet found language. She felt his gaze dip briefly to her mouth, then back to her eyes. She felt it in the quiet curve of her smile, the way her shoulder leaned ever so slightly toward him. For a heartbeat, the space between them tightened. Their hands didn't touch, but they could have. Their lips didn't meet, but the idea of it pulsed quietly in the space between words. "And then," Ethan whispered, almost so soft she didn't hear it. "Not yet." Naomi closed her eyes for a breath, then opened them again. She nodded. "I know." And just like that, the moment folded gently into itself, not rushed, not broken, just returned to stillness. Like dancers who knew the music wasn't over, they stepped back in tandem and just paused. Ethan looked down at her hands. "You hold things like they're fragile." "They usually are," she replied. He studied her for a beat, then nodded. offering her his coffee with a crooked smile. "Want the last sip?" She took it, sipped, then wrinkled her nose. "Too sweet," she said. "Hopeful," he corrected. Naomi laughed. And in the golden hush of that nearly empty office, two people stood shoulder to shoulder, two hearts that had seen too much and yet still believed, even quietly, that some things were worth unfolding slowly. Almost something. Just not yet, but soon. It was just past noon on a Sunday when the knock came, not the polite kind, not a neighbor with a package knock. It was sharp and urgent, like someone demanding entrance rather than requesting it. Naomi froze in the middle of her kitchen, teacup halfway to her lips, her breath catching before her mind caught up. The knock came again. She didn't ask who it was. She already knew. Her fingers unclenched slowly from the mug as she walked toward the door, not with fear, but with a steadiness she hadn't felt in months. She opened it with a controlled calm, like someone who had nothing left to be startled by. Marcus stood on the other side. His presence hadn't changed, tall, immaculately dressed, that same faint air of practiced superiority clinging to his frame like cologne. But the rain had softened his edges, darkened the shoulders of his blazer, and blurred the lines between composure and discomfort. He scanned her face, expecting something. Surprise, maybe. Guilt. Grief. But Naomi gave him none of it. She tilted her head slightly. "Marcus." He blinked. "So this is it, then?" She didn't answer. Didn't need to. "You faint in court," he continued, stepping a half-inch too far into the doorway. "Get carried away like some tragic heroine. And now what, lend yourself a CEO with a savior complex?" There it was. The venom was dressed in a business-casual tone. Naomi's gaze didn't flinch. What I landed was peace. He laughed, bitter and clipped. "You think people aren't talking? You think they don't see what you're doing?" She stepped aside just enough to let the doorframe claim its space again. "My recovery," she said, voice even, "isn't a performance. And it's not for them. Or you." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "So, what now you're working for him? Gonna move in? Change your name? Pretend this whole breakdown didn't happen?" She didn't look away. "I don't have to pretend anything. I lived it. I survived it." He scoffed, stepping forward again, but Naomi met him halfway. "Marcus," she said, not loud but firm, "you lost the right to narrate my story the day you stopped showing up in it. You left long before I collapsed." Something flickered in his expression. Something not quite regret, not quite understanding, just resistance, an ego unused to hearing no in such elegant terms. "And what's he doing?" he snapped. "Feeding you lines? Playing the good guy?" Naomi shook her head slowly. "No. He listens." A new voice rose behind Marcus, then calm, even, unmistakably composed. "Is there a reason you're raising your voice at a woman who asked you nothing?" Both of them turned. Ethan stood at the base of the hallway stairs, one hand resting casually in his coat pocket, the other holding a slim folder of marked-up manuscript pages. His expression was unreadable, not hostile, but alert, present. Marcus straightened, as if trying to reclaim his height. "This isn't your business." Ethan stepped forward, closing the space like someone trained to move with quiet precision. "You're right," he said. "But when a man shows up at a woman's door uninvited, dismisses her pain, and questions her healing, that becomes everyone's business." The air pulled taut between them. Marcus shifted. "She's manipulating this, don't be naive. She fainted for attention. Now she's crawling into your lap for sympathy." Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "She collapsed because no one noticed she was drowning while smiling," he said. You ignored her until her silence cracked open. And now you're angry someone else stayed. Marcus faltered. His mouth opened, closed. You didn't lose her because of me, Ethan added. You lost her when you treated her strength like an obligation instead of a grace. Marcus looked at Naomi one last time, searching for weakness, for the woman he used to interrupt and diminish. But she didn't flinch, didn't soften. She stood like someone who had outgrown apology. Leave, Ethan said, with the quiet finality of a door closing. Marcus hesitated for a breath, then left. No slammed words, no vindication, just retreat. The silence that followed was thick with release. Naomi exhaled, not from exhaustion, but relief. Ethan didn't speak right away. He stepped inside gently, placed the folder on her kitchen table, then turned back to her with a gaze that didn't ask for anything, only offered something steady. You didn't have to say anything, she murmured. I didn't say it for you, he replied softly. I said it because someone should have said it long ago. She looked at him. Not like a woman looking at her rescuer, like a woman seeing the person who stood beside her without needing to be begged. It was the difference between being saved and being respected. Later, after he left, Naomi stood in the bathroom, staring at her reflection. Her curls fell softly around her face, her eyes clear, not red or shadowed. She ran a hand over her cheek, as if testing the texture of her composure. And then she did something she hadn't done in a long time. She smiled, not because everything was fixed, but because nothing was being denied anymore. Her voice, her boundaries, her right to take up space without justifying why she deserved to. And that, she realized, was the most honest kind of beginning. It was an ordinary Tuesday when the email arrived. No subject line, just a name in the inbox. Ethan Callahan. Naomi had just returned from the bookstore down the block, the cold spring wind still clinging to her coat, her cheeks flushed from the walk. The kettle hadn't even finished whistling when she sat at her desk and clicked it open. There were only 2 lines. Are you free Thursday evening? No meetings, just dinner, and no pressure, of course. Naomi stared at the screen longer than necessary. He hadn't signed it. He didn't need to. It wasn't a date. At least, that's what she told herself as she stood in front of her closet 2 days later, torn between the navy dress she wore when she needed to feel grounded and the soft gray one that always felt like armor disguised as silk. She chose neither. Instead, she pulled out a deep emerald blouse, something she hadn't worn in years, tucked away beneath other versions of herself. It whispered confidence, but didn't shout. It reminded her of summer leaves and still water. The restaurant was tucked inside a quiet corner of the West End. Nothing flashy. Just brick walls, dim lighting, and a soft jazz trio in the back, playing as if they were speaking in secrets. When she arrived, Ethan was already there. Not on his phone, not tapping impatiently, just seated, watching the room with that unreadable softness he wore like a second skin. He stood when he saw her. Naomi, he said, like it was a thought, not a greeting. She sat across from him, her coat folded neatly on the chair beside her, her fingers brushing the rim of the water glass to anchor herself. Thank you for coming, he said. You made it sound like I had a choice, she replied with a gentle smile. You always do. They ordered slowly, letting the silence between questions do its quiet work. The conversation started with simple things, books, a manuscript she was struggling with, and a debate over whether New York or San Francisco had better independent bookstores. But somewhere between the main course and dessert, the air shifted. Not in a way you could see. How do you feel when someone starts to speak with more pauses than words? Ethan looked at her, long and measured, as if he were weighing whether to say what he came here to say or just let the night stay light. Naomi tilted her head. "You're thinking something." "I'm always thinking about something," he said. "Then say it." He hesitated, then leaned forward just slightly, folding his hands together. "I've been trying to figure out whether I've been waiting for you," he said, "or if I just finally noticed you." Naomi blinked. The sentence didn't ask for a reply. It offered a truth. He continued, "You don't rush to fill space. You wait until it's necessary. Most people try to make themselves visible. You just are." Her breath caught in her chest. "Ethan, you don't owe me anything," he said quickly. "This isn't a moment where I ask for something. He paused, searching. "I wanted you to know what being around you feels like." Naomi sat back, her fingers gently brushing the edge of the tablecloth, her heart walking a quiet line between tenderness and hesitation. "I've spent a long time being something for someone else," she said. "Supportive, convenient, manageable. I forgot what it felt like to be wanted without performing." His gaze didn't leave hers. "You don't have to perform with me." There was no music swelling, no dramatic interruption. Just the steady pulse of two people admitting something neither had planned to say aloud. She picked up her glass, sipped slowly, then set it down. "Okay," she whispered, not as permission, as acknowledgement. They left the restaurant and walked side by side down the block, the air crisp but not cold, the sky that kind of deep navy that only happens between winter and spring. Streetlights painted warm pools of gold on the pavement, and Naomi's heels echoed gently as they moved. When they reached the corner where they'd part ways, they stopped. "I'll walk you," Ethan offered. Naomi shook her head. "No need." He nodded. No protest. Just respect. They stood there for a moment, words hovering but not spoken. And then Naomi reached out, just briefly, and touched his wrist. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For noticing without needing to claim." Ethan smiled. "That's easy. You're impossible not to notice." They didn't kiss. No touch was more intimate than that brush of her fingers on his skin. But something had shifted. Something had begun. Not because they named it, but because they didn't need to. Naomi didn't sleep that night. It wasn't anxiety that kept her awake, nor confusion. It was something more elusive, something like warmth, but quieter, as if the soft echo of Ethan's words had nestled beneath her collarbone and decided to stay. She lay in bed, eyes tracing shadows on the ceiling, the sound of his voice replaying not in memory, but in sensation. He had said, "I've been trying to figure out whether I've been waiting for you, or if I just finally noticed you." And the truth was, it wasn't the declaration that startled her. It was how gently it had been delivered. No expectation, no pressure, just presence. Naomi had lived a life of interruptions of men who reached for her only to reshape her, to mold her into something easier, quieter, more convenient. She had grown used to becoming small in the presence of love, until now. Ethan hadn't asked her to be less. He had seen her fullness and stayed. The days that followed unfolded without labels. He didn't text her every hour. She didn't wonder where he was. But they saw each other, unspoken patterns beginning to form. Sometimes he dropped off a book at her desk without a note. Sometimes she left an annotated manuscript on his chair, margins filled with observations only he would notice. On Thursday afternoon, she found a single sheet of paper slid beneath her office door. No name. Just a quote handwritten in ink. "I want to be near you silently," like a word just about to be spoken. She read it twice, then placed it inside her notebook without a smile, but with something far more profound, a calm recognition. It wasn't until Saturday that the rhythm broke. Her phone rang just after noon. She was slicing peaches in her kitchen, sun filling the room in lazy streaks. When she saw Ethan's name, her heart lifted slightly, but the moment she answered, she knew something was off. His voice was too still. "Can you meet me?" he asked. Her reply was immediate. "Where?" He was waiting on a bench near the conservatory, beneath a row of leafless trees, stretching bare arms into the sky. The chill hadn't fully lifted yet, and his coat collar was turned against the wind. Naomi approached quietly, her boots brushing against the gravel path. When he looked up, his eyes were different, unreadable, not because he was hiding, but because he didn't know his feelings yet. She sat beside him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he said, "My father is in the hospital." Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't offer immediate comfort or fill the space with reassurances. She waited. Ethan exhaled. "He collapsed at home this morning. They say it's not life-threatening." "But it shook me." Naomi turned toward him. "Are you close?" He hesitated. "No. Not really." She nodded. That said, enough. He was the kind of man who always asked what I'd built, never how I felt. Ethan continued, his voice dry. "And when I started the company, I think he saw it as a victory for himself." Naomi didn't reach for his hand, but her nearness was a touch of its own. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "fathers teach us how to build walls, and sometimes we only realize that too late to tear them down." Ethan looked at her then. Looked. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Say things that don't hurt, but still make the truth unavoidable." She smiled softly. "It's not a skill. It's a survival instinct." They sat there for a while, letting the air stretch out between them, not needing to rush it. Naomi spoke again. "You don't owe him reconciliation, not if it costs you peace." He nodded slowly, as if trying on her words like a suit he wasn't sure fit yet. Then quietly, "When I saw him hooked up to the monitors, I didn't feel anger. I just felt tired." Naomi's gaze didn't waver. That's grief. Not for the man he was, but for the relationship that never got to be. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. And in that small stillness, a different kind of intimacy unfolded, not rooted in flirtation or declarations, but in emotional nakedness. In knowing that here, in this quiet space on a cold bench, he could be someone without a mask. He turned toward her, eyes softer now. "Would you come with me tomorrow?" Naomi blinked. "To the hospital?" she asked gently. He nodded. "I don't want to walk in alone." She hesitated, but not out of doubt, only because she understood what he was asking. It wasn't about his father. It was about not carrying the weight of silence on his own. She met his gaze and said, "Yes." And in that single word, something shifted. Not between them, but within them. The kind of shift that happens not with grand gestures, but with the quiet agreement. "I'll stand beside you when you're ready to fall." Later that night, Naomi sat in bed, her hand curled around a book she wasn't reading, her thoughts far from the page. And it struck her. Love doesn't always enter with fanfare. Sometimes, it begins on a bench in the cold, with a man who finally says, "I don't want to do this alone," and a woman who replies, "You don't have to." The hospital smelled of antiseptic and muted hope. Naomi had always disliked that scent, not for what it was, but for what it represented. A place where people waited too long to speak, then spoke only in hushed voices. Where love was measured in heart monitors and plastic chairs. Where time felt suspended, but the consequences never were. She walked beside Ethan through the long, sterile corridor, her heels clicking softly against the linoleum floor. His hand hovered near hers, but didn't reach. It didn't need to. The nearness was enough. He was silent, not withdrawn, just deeply present in his thoughts. Naomi didn't interrupt. She understood this kind of silence, the type that wrapped itself around old wounds, that demanded stillness to be heard. They stopped outside room 314. Ethan exhaled slowly, as if bracing himself not for his father's condition, but for the memories the room might stir. "He won't know what to say," Ethan murmured. Naomi looked at him. "Then say nothing." He turned to her. "What do you mean?" "Sit. Watch the machines beep. Let the silence be a language. You don't have to fill the space with meaning. You're not here to fix the past, Ethan. To witness the present." He nodded, his jaw tense. Then, without another word, he opened the door. The room was dim, lit by the soft glow of monitors and a narrow window that filtered gray daylight across the bed. Ethan's father lay there, paler than Ethan remembered, thinned by age and illness. The man who once stood like a pillar now sunken into white sheets. The sight didn't break Ethan, but it did bend him. He stood there for a moment, not moving, not speaking. Naomi remained just outside the door, allowing him space. She watched as he slowly walked to the chair beside the bed and sat, folding his hands in his lap. His father stirred slightly, eyes fluttering open. For a moment, confusion passed over his face. Then something resembling recognition, faint but real. "You came," the older man rasped. Ethan nodded. "I did." There was a long pause. "You didn't have to," the man whispered. "I know." Another silence. Then barely audible. "You always did things your way." It wasn't a compliment, but it also wasn't quite a wound. Ethan looked at him. "And you always measured love by obedience." His father turned his head slightly. "Is that what you think?" Ethan didn't answer right away. "It's what I felt." There was no apology in the air, but there was a pause, one of those rare pauses that felt like surrender and restraint, as if two men finally admitted that neither had the tools to bridge the ocean. They stood on opposite sides. "I'm tired," the older man muttered. Ethan leaned forward, his voice softer. "Then rest." After a while, Naomi padded into the room and stood behind him. Ethan looked up at her, eyes heavy with something unshed, something between grief and quiet clarity. He stood and gestured silently for her to take his place by the bed. She sat down, folding her hands calmly, her presence like a balm in the sterile air. The older man glanced at her, puzzled. "This is Naomi," Ethan said gently. Friend." Naomi didn't smile. She didn't soften her posture to make herself smaller, more palatable. She nodded, her gaze steady. Ethan's father looked at her, something unreadable flickering across his face. Then, for the first time in the room, a whisper of something softened. "Your voice is calm," he murmured. Naomi replied evenly, "Only when I'm listening." He blinked, as if startled by the reply. Ethan watched from behind, unmoving. It wasn't about who Naomi was to him. It was about what she represented in this room, a kind of humanity that didn't perform, demand, or defend. Just was. And in that simple presence, something shifted. After 20 minutes, they left the room. Ethan didn't speak until they reached the car. "She asked me once," he said, staring through the windshield. "My mother. She asked me if I resented him." Naomi looked over. "What did you say?" "I told her no, that I respected him. But the truth is, I didn't know how to mourn someone who was still alive. Naomi placed her hand gently over his. No words, just the warmth of skin to skin. I'm not angry anymore, he added. Just done waiting. She understood what he meant. Done waiting for affection to be earned. Done waiting for closure that may never come. Done shaping himself around the absence of a father's softness. Later that evening, they sat in Naomi's apartment, no music, no wine, just the faint sound of the city outside the window. She curled her legs beneath her on the couch. Ethan leaned back, one arm draped along the top cushion, his fingers brushing her shoulder. It wasn't intentional. It just happened to be where he belonged. I didn't know it could feel like this, he said. Like what? This quiet, with someone, and not feel alone. Naomi turned to him, her voice barely above a breath. It's not quiet, it's safety. He looked at her, something unspoken moving behind his eyes. And then, for the first time, he leaned in, not with urgency, but with a stillness so intimate it felt sacred. When their lips met, it wasn't fireworks, it was exhale. Somewhere far away, a machine beeped steadily in a hospital room. But here on, a couch in a small apartment, lit by the golden hue of evening. Two people kissed, like they had finally found a home that didn't need building, just opening. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it also wasn't love. There was something sacred about the space they now occupied together. Something unnamed, perhaps undefinable, but undeniably present. Like the hush between heartbeats, where feeling lives before language dares to name it. After the kiss, Naomi had rested her head against Ethan's shoulder, and he'd pulled her in without speaking. They sat that way for what felt like hours. No confessions, no promises, just warmth, breath, the safety of not being asked to explain themselves. And when Ethan eventually left, he didn't say, "I'll call you." He didn't need to. The quiet between them had become a covenant. Naomi's world didn't change overnight. The city still bustled. Her apartment still creaked in the same corners. Her deadlines still loomed like shadows. But everything felt less jagged, softer in its edges, like the world had stopped rubbing her raw and started noticing her shape. She caught herself smiling at small things, a bird on the fire escape, the way sunlight streaked across the hardwood. Ethan's name lit up her phone, not urgently, but with a gentle anticipation. There was no game, no performance, only presence. Ethan, for his part, moved through his days differently too. He still walked into boardrooms with that same composed gravity and reviewed quarterly projections, with a mind like a scalpel. Still signed off on million-dollar proposals before his second cup of coffee. But he began keeping his afternoons freer, just in case Naomi called, just in case she wanted to walk by the water or stop by the little bakery that made almond croissants the size of her hand. He never told her, but he ordered 2 every time, even if she said she wasn't hungry. Because sometimes she changed her mind. And sometimes love was simply about remembering someone's second thoughts before they were spoken. One afternoon, they found themselves at the botanical gardens. It was Naomi's idea. She said she needed to see something green that didn't live in a spreadsheet. Ethan smiled and told her he needed the same, though, secretly, he'd never been to that part of the city before. They wandered through the winding glass house, past hanging ferns and slow-moving koi. Naomi kept pausing to read the little placards beside each plant. Ethan, on the other hand, kept watching her. "You know," he said softly as she studied the ficus leaves, "you're the first person I've spent time with who looks at the world like it's made of secrets worth uncovering." She glanced at him, amused. "And you? What do you see?" He hesitated. "I used to look at everything like a problem to be solved. And now?" He didn't answer. Instead, he gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Naomi didn't pull away. She only whispered, "Don't say it unless you mean it." "I won't," he replied. Then, "But I'm starting to." She turned back toward the ficus, eyes misted with something that wasn't sadness, just knowing. But just as they learned how to breathe each other's air, the world true to form stirred. While Naomi slept with her phone on silent that night, a call came through. One she wouldn't see until morning. Ethan wouldn't know how to tell her about it, because he hadn't answered it either. But it had come. From Isabella Montgomery, Ethan's ex-wife. Naomi found the voicemail at 6:42 a.m. She was pouring coffee, half awake, still in her robe. She saw the name on her screen and froze, not with jealousy, but with the sharp recognition that stories always have chapters that try to return when you're finally rewriting the ending. She clicked play. "Ethan," the voice said. "It's Isabella. I know this is unexpected, but I need to see you. Not for me. For something that involves both of us. Call me." The message ended. Naomi didn't flinch, but her hand gripped the coffee mug a little too tightly. Ethan called her 2 hours later. "I was going to tell you," he said without prompting. "I just didn't know how." Naomi was quiet on the other end. "Isabella doesn't call me unless she wants something," he added. "I don't know what this is about yet. Are you going to meet her?" "I think I have to. Do you want to?" A pause. "No. But I don't believe in running from the past, Naomi. I did that once. It costs more than honesty." Naomi breathed in. "Then go." "I don't want this to change anything between us," he said. She let that sit for a beat, then answered, "It already has. But not in the way you think." That night, she didn't wait by the phone. She poured herself wine, picked up a novel, and watched the rain tap against her window like the world had forgotten how to be loud. She didn't feel threatened. She felt aware. There was a before and an after to every love story. And sometimes, the middle was where ghosts returned, not to haunt, but to test whether what had been built could hold under pressure. Ethan met Isabella in a hotel lobby the next day. They didn't embrace. They didn't fall into old rhythms. They sat across from each other with the kind of stillness that comes from knowing a door had been closed for good. But someone had left a hand on the knob anyway. "What is it?" he asked gently. Isabella didn't play coy. She slid an envelope across the table. He opened it and froze. Inside was a picture. A boy, 5 years old, with his eyes. And Naomi had no idea. Yet, the photograph felt heavier than paper had a right to. Ethan stared at the boy's face, round cheeks, dark curls, eyes wide and familiar. Too familiar. They carried the same quiet intensity he saw each morning in his reflection. The kind of gaze that didn't just look, but caught. He blinked once, then again. Isabella didn't say a word at first. She let the image do what her voice could not. "I didn't mean to keep him from you," she said eventually, her voice thin with something close to regret, but not quite landing there. "At first, I didn't know. And then when I did, I thought I was protecting him." "From me?" Ethan asked quietly, eyes still on the photo. "From everything. The press, the money, your world. You weren't the man I would have trusted back then. And I was angry. You were angry." He slowly lifted his gaze. "So you just disappeared. Cut me off. Moved on. I thought you had too." There it was, the quiet justification wrapped in a half apology. The boy's name was Lucas, 5 years old. He liked building things out of blocks. He hated broccoli but loved chocolate chip pancakes. He was shy with strangers but loud when dancing. He had a scar above his left eyebrow from a fall on the playground. And he had never heard Ethan's name. Not once. "He doesn't know anything about me?" Ethan asked, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Isabella shook her head. "I didn't know how to explain to you. I wasn't sure if you'd even want to know." He let out a long, slow breath. "You thought I'd just walk away?" "You always walked away, Ethan. From emotions. From conflict. From me." A pause. And then, softer. "But maybe I should have let you prove me wrong." Naomi sat at her desk, a manuscript open but unread before her. Her eyes drifted toward the window repeatedly, watching clouds shift across the glass. She hadn't heard from Ethan in hours. She wasn't the kind of woman to keep checking her phone. And yet, she had. 3 times already. She wasn't jealous of Isabella. That wasn't it. She just knew that people's pasts weren't always closed chapters. Sometimes they were live wires, and when touched intentionally or not, they sparked more than memories. They reignited versions of ourselves we thought we buried. She didn't doubt Ethan, but she did fear what truths might follow him back. That evening, Ethan finally knocked on her door. When Naomi opened it, she didn't smile. She didn't frown either. She stepped aside, letting him in without words. Ethan walked into the living room and stood momentarily, unsure whether to sit or remain standing. Finally, he turned to face her. "There's something you need to see." He pulled the photo from his coat pocket and handed it to her without a flourish. Naomi took it, and for a moment, she said nothing. Her eyes lingered on the boy's face. When she looked up, her voice was steady. "He's yours?" Ethan nodded once. "His name is Lucas. He's 5. Naomi didn't react with shock. No gasp, no retreat. She always wore the same unbearable quiet. The truth arrived without ceremony. "And you didn't know?" she asked. "I didn't," he said. "Not until today." She handed the photo back and sat slowly on the edge of the couch. "How do you feel?" Ethan gave a bitter laugh, like the floors shifted, like I've been walking on a version of myself that was missing a limb and didn't know it. Naomi looked at him. "And what do you want now?" It was a question with 1,000 answers, but only one mattered. "I want to meet him," Ethan said. "I want to know him, be part of his world, if he'll have me." "But," he hesitated, "but I also want to be honest with you. I don't know how this changes things between us." Naomi didn't flinch. She looked at him carefully, her voice calm but firm. "You're not asking me to make space for a child. You're asking me to make space for the man about to become a father." Ethan stepped closer. "And if I asked you to stand beside me through it?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood, walking past him toward the window. Outside, the city moved in blinks of red taillights and distant sirens. When she finally spoke, her back was still to him. "Children don't ruin love," she said softly. "But lies do. Secrets do." Ethan's voice cracked. "I didn't lie." "No," she said, turning. "But the woman before me did. And you loved her once. Enough to create a life." He walked toward her. "I don't love her now. That's not the part that scares me. What does?" Naomi looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "That you might love him more than anything else. And I won't know where I fit anymore." Ethan reached for her hand, and this time, she let him. "I don't need you to fit around him," he said. "I need to build something where you both belong." Later that night, they sat on the floor beside the couch, legs stretched out, the photograph resting between them on the rug like an invitation neither of them knew how to answer. Naomi ran her finger along the edge of the photo. He has your eyes. Ethan exhaled. That's what scares me. Why? Because I know how much those eyes have seen, and I don't want him to carry the same weight I did. Naomi placed her hand gently over his. Then give him better to see. They didn't talk much after that, but in the quiet, a new door opened. Not one they had planned for. Not one of them even knew how to walk through it. But it stood there, open, waiting. The next morning was oddly still. Naomi woke before her alarm, the lights soft and gray against her curtains. Ethan had already left. He'd kissed her forehead in the early hours and whispered he had something to take care of. She didn't ask what. She didn't need to. The photograph still sat on her coffee table, untouched since the night before. She stared at it now, cradling a mug of tea that had long gone cold. The boy's face stared back at her, earnest, open, unknowingly complicated. Lucas. It was a lovely name, and a heavier one now, because it belonged to someone who would forever tether Ethan to a life Naomi wasn't part of, not in its origin or history. She wasn't scared of the boy. She wasn't even scared of the past. What unsettled her was the beginning of something that hadn't asked her permission to exist, yet demanded a place in the center of everything. Across the city, Ethan stood in a small park. It wasn't the kind of place billionaires usually visited, a quiet playground tucked behind a modest preschool, where the benches were faded and the mulch under the swings smelled like rain. But it was where Isabella had said she brought Lucas on Saturdays. This Saturday, Ethan asked if he could come, not to speak, not to claim, to see. Isabella had agreed with surprising calm. She even said, "He looks a lot like you when he's thinking." Ethan hadn't known what to do with that sentence, so he'd said nothing. Now, he stood beneath a tree, hands in his coat pockets, watching the world unfold in miniature. Lucas was at the sandbox, building something too intense for a child his age. His brows furrowed, his tongue peeking out at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't loud, like the other boys. He moved with a focus, a stillness in motion. Ethan watched, heart aching in places he didn't know, but he still held his breath. Isabella sat nearby on a bench. At one point, she glanced over at Ethan, her eyes soft. "He doesn't know who you are," she said. "Not yet. I know. I wanted you to see him first, before we figure out the rest." Ethan nodded. Then, "He builds with intention." Isabella smiled faintly. "He always has. He doesn't just play. He designs." He watched in silence a moment longer. "Does he like stories?" Ethan asked. "Loves them. He makes up whole worlds in his head. Tells me about dragons who don't breathe fire but protect books instead." Ethan's chest tightened. He remembered being that child and inventing things to survive what he couldn't say aloud. "What will you tell him?" he asked. Isabella was quiet for a moment. Then, that there's a man who wanted to meet him, who didn't know he existed until now, and that he looks at him like he's seeing the best part of himself. Ethan swallowed hard. It was strange, watching a life that had grown without him, and feeling both grief and grace in the same breath. That night, Naomi didn't ask how it went. Ethan didn't offer details either. Instead, he sat beside her in the kitchen, quietly peeling an orange, handing her segments one at a time. It was an intimacy born not from desire but acceptance. That sometimes comfort was citrus and silence, not questions and answers. "I'm going to see him again," Ethan finally said. Naomi nodded. "You should." He looked at her carefully. "Are you still with me in this?" She looked up. "Are you asking if I'll stay?" "I'm asking if this scares you too much." She thought for a moment. Then, "I'm not scared of your son, Ethan. I'm scared of becoming an afterthought in your redemption story. He reached for her hand, firm this time, grounding. You're not the footnote, he said. You're the chapter I want to get right. Days passed. Ethan met Lucas again, this time at a children's museum, where they moved through exhibits of light and shadow, water and wind. Ethan didn't tell Lucas who he was. He didn't need to. The boy took his hand at one point, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It undid Ethan in a way that didn't show on his face, but lived in his bones. Isabella stood a few steps behind, watching. She said very little. Her presence was quiet, but her gaze was firm, like a mother letting go and holding on simultaneously. When Lucas fell asleep in the back seat of her car afterward, Ethan stood by the window for a long moment, his hand gently resting against the glass. I never imagined this, he said quietly. Neither did I, Isabella replied. But here we are. That evening, Ethan cooked dinner for Naomi. He chopped vegetables clumsily, burned the first round of garlic, and swore under his breath. Naomi watched from the doorway, laughing behind a wineglass. This is adorable, she teased. This is tragic, he corrected. No, this man is trying to anchor his heart after uprooting it. He looked up and smiled. Later, as they ate at the kitchen island, Naomi set her fork down and asked the question she hadn't dared to voice. Do you want him to live with you? Ethan paused, fork midair. I don't know. I haven't let myself think that far. But you will. He nodded. Eventually, maybe. If he wants it. If it's right. Naomi looked at him, long and quietly. I'd support that, she said, even if it's complicated. He reached across the table and took her hand. It will be, but I've never wanted anything simple with you. That night, they didn't fall asleep quickly. They lay beneath the same blanket, breathing the same air, their limbs tangled in that quiet choreography lovers learn when neither wants to let go first. Naomi whispered, Promise me one thing, anything. Don't ever ask me to disappear so he can have all of you. Ethan didn't move. I won't, he said, but I might ask you to become part of his world. She turned to him fully. Then let's build it carefully, and in that one line delivered not with fear, but with fierce tenderness. The next chapter began writing itself, not in ink, but in trust. In truth, a family isn't always built from biology or vows. Sometimes it starts with a boy and a woman who says, I see him too. Spring arrived quietly, not in a burst of blossoms or the dramatic peeling back of winter's weight, but in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Naomi noticed it first in the air, warmer, more forgiving. Then, in Ethan, who smiled more often, not out of habit, but because the world around him had begun to thaw in ways he hadn't expected. And then, most unexpectedly, in Lucas. He came over one Sunday afternoon, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders, filled with a chaotic mix of Lego pieces, a half-eaten sandwich, and a worn-out book about a dragon who was afraid of fire. Ethan had arranged it all with Isabella, who'd been cautious but cooperative. Naomi opened the door, unsure of what to expect. Lucas stared at her with curious, unblinking eyes. You're Naomi, he said. She crouched down to his level, meeting his gaze. And you're Lucas. He nodded. I like your dress, he added, then walked past her without hesitation, dragging his backpack behind him. Naomi blinked, then smiled. It was the smallest of beginnings, but beginnings rarely arrive grand. The first visit was simple. They baked cookies. Well tried. Ethan misread the recipe and added salt instead of sugar. Lucas thought it was hilarious and kept calling them Dad's revenge cookies. Naomi watched them from the corner of the kitchen, flour on her cheek, heart slowly folding open like a letter she hadn't meant to send, but was grateful to have written. The next visit, they built a pillow fort in the living room. Naomi added string lights, and Lucas declared it better than his mom's house, then quickly apologized for saying it aloud. Naomi ruffled his curls and said, "You can love both places." He smiled widely. He stayed inside the fort for nearly an hour, reading his book to a very attentive Ethan, who listened like the fate of the world depended on the ending. It wasn't easy. There were moments when Lucas asked why he hadn't met Ethan sooner, moments when Ethan didn't know how to answer, when he stumbled, when his silence stretched too long. Naomi gently stepped in to bridge the space between a father who didn't yet know how to be one and a boy who needed more than explanations. There were nights when Naomi lay awake beside Ethan, wondering if her presence would eventually feel like an intrusion. She asked if the growing bond between father and son might make her unnecessary, like a beautiful placeholder in someone else's permanent story. But then, there were moments like this. Lucas lost a tooth. It happened over lunch, right before biting into an apple. He held the small, bloody thing in his hand with awe and a touch of panic. Ethan looked ready to call a dentist. Naomi knelt beside Lucas, wiping his chin with a napkin, smiling gently. "You know what this means?" she said. Lucas shook his head, unsure. "You're growing, becoming more you. That's a big deal." He blinked. "Will the tooth fairy come?" "Only if you put it under your pillow," she whispered. Lucas turned to Ethan. "Do you have a tooth fairy at your house?" Ethan chuckled. "I can ask her to stop by." Lucas considered it, then looked at Naomi. "Will she know I'm staying here tonight?" Naomi smiled. "We'll make sure she knows exactly where to find you." Lucas grinned, a toothless, giddy thing, and hugged her without warning. She froze for a second, then melted. And in that hug, something settled. Not a title, not a role, just belonging. A few weeks later, they were all watching a movie one night. Curled between them on the couch, Lucas was half asleep, his fingers still holding on to Naomi's. The film's dialogue faded into a soft background hum. Ethan looked down at the boy whose world had changed without his permission, but who had adapted, heart first. And then, Lucas mumbled something in a sleep-drenched voice. "Night, Mom." Naomi stiffened. Ethan turned toward her, but she didn't say anything. She didn't correct him, didn't move. She only closed her eyes and let it land. Later, in the dark, when Lucas was asleep in the guest room and the city outside hummed with weekend life, Naomi stood at the window, arms crossed. Ethan approached slowly. "I heard him," he said gently. She nodded. So did I. He stood beside her, unsure whether to speak. Naomi finally said, "It's not that I want to replace her. That's not it. I know. But hearing it felt like I was standing on a cliff, like one more step could be a fall or a flight." Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "If he called you that, it felt true to him, not because he forgot her, but because he sees you." Naomi swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Am I allowed to want this?" Ethan's voice was firm. "Yes," then softer. "I want it too." Over time, Naomi became part of the rhythm. She helped pack Lucas's lunches, picked out library books he hadn't yet read, sat beside him while he built impossible Lego towers, tucked him into bed with stories that weren't just fairy tales, but fragments of truth disguised in magic. One night, Lucas asked, "Did you know my dad used not to smile much?" Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "Yeah. But now he smiles all the time." She smirked. "You think that's because of you?" Lucas nodded. And you? Naomi paused, then kissed the top of his head. Well, then we're a good team. The team didn't always win. Some days were more challenging than others. There were custody miscommunications, late-night fevers. Ethan's meetings ran long, Naomi's career demands. Tensions flared, not out of resentment, but exhaustion and the weight of trying to hold something delicate and beautiful without breaking it. But they learned how to say sorry without blame, how to hold space when someone was too tired to speak. How can we let the hard days pass like the weather? And through it all, Lucas grew, not just in inches or vocabulary, but in security, in the knowing that he was loved, fully, in multiple directions. One Saturday morning, Lucas stood in the hallway, holding a crayon drawing. Naomi bent down to examine it. 3 stick figures, one tall, one with curly hair, one smaller, with a blue cape. "Is this us?" she asked. Lucas nodded. "That's you," he pointed. "That's Dad. That's me." "And what's this?" she asked, gesturing to the cape. He beamed. "That's so I can fly. But I only fly when both of you are holding my hands." Naomi's heart tightened. Ethan walked in, looked at the picture, and said nothing. He just smiled. Because some truths don't need words. They only need to be witnessed. It was a rainy Sunday in early June when Naomi realized she had become a fixture in their lives, not as an accessory or an afterthought, but as something deeply rooted. The kind of presence you don't question until you try to imagine its absence. The soft patter of rain on the windows echoed in the kitchen, where she stood barefoot, stirring a pot of tomato soup. Lucas sat cross-legged at the table, scribbling over a half-finished crossword puzzle with the kind of ferocity only a child could manage. Across the room, Ethan leaned against the doorframe, shirt sleeves rolled up, watching them with that quiet, unreadable expression he wore when he was most content. Nothing dramatic was happening. And yet, everything was. "I think I should write a story," Lucas announced. Naomi smiled. "What's it about?" He looked up, thoughtful. "About a boy with 2 homes. But instead of being sad, it's like both houses have magic, and he has a key to each." She paused in her stirring. "That's a beautiful idea," she said gently. Lucas didn't look up. He was coloring in a drawing beside his title, "The Boy with 2 Keys." Ethan walked over and placed a soft kiss on Naomi's shoulder. "You did that," he murmured. Naomi turned slightly. "Did what?" "Made him feel like having more than one home isn't a loss." She held his gaze. "We did that." And there it was again, that subtle shift. The unspoken understanding is that they are building something together, not just around each other. Later that evening, after Lucas had fallen asleep in his tangle of blankets and stuffed animals, Naomi found herself in the backyard, a light blanket over her shoulders, watching the sky clear through drifting clouds. Ethan joined her without a word, handing her a mug of warm tea. They sat silently for a long time, the kind that doesn't ask to be filled. Then he said, "I've been thinking." She arched a brow. "Dangerous." He chuckled. "Probably, but I'm going to risk it." She waited. "I never thought I'd have this," he said quietly. "A life where things didn't need fixing all the time. The people I love don't feel like pieces I'm constantly trying to hold together." Naomi looked down at her tea. "Do you still feel like you're fixing things now?" He shook his head. "No. I feel like I'm learning how to keep something whole." She swallowed gently. He took her free hand. "And I want you to know," he said, voice more steady now, "that I choose this. Not because it's convenient or familiar, but because it's what I want to wake up to. Every day. Even on the hard ones." Naomi didn't reply right away. Instead, she studied him, the way his jaw tightened when he said something vulnerable, the flicker in his eyes that hinted at all the versions of Ethan he used to be. The broken ones, the ones who'd built walls to survive. And then she smiled. Not a wide smile, but the kind that lived in the corners of her eyes, quiet and real. "I know," she whispered. The weeks that followed weren't perfect. Naomi's work picked up pace. An unexpected editing project demanded more hours than she had to give. Ethan's company faced a small but public PR issue. Something about a misunderstood acquisition that spiraled online before the truth could catch up. Stress crept in the way it always does, in missed calls, unfinished conversations, short fuses. One evening, Naomi snapped at Ethan over something small after a particularly long day. A dish was left out. A tone misunderstood. It wasn't about the thing, of course. It never is. She regretted it the moment the words left her lips. But before she could apologize, Ethan reached for her hand. "Tell me what it's really about," he said gently. And just like that, the fight unraveled into honesty. She told him she felt stretched thin and was scared of losing herself trying to hold everything together. He didn't try to fix it. He just listened. And when she finished, he pulled her close and whispered, "You don't have to carry it all. Not alone." That was the night she cried, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she was finally allowed not to be strong. One Saturday, Lucas brought home a handmade card from school. It was a simple craft construction paper, folded into uneven halves, glitter glued in erratic lines, misspelled words written in red marker. On the front it said, "To my real family." Inside, a crayon drawing of 3 people holding hands. Naomi is in the middle, Ethan on one side, Lucas on the other hand. No explanations, no disclaimers, just the truth of how he saw them. Naomi read it in the kitchen while Lucas ran outside to play. Ethan watched her eyes fill slowly. She didn't speak. She just pressed the card against her heart and smiled through the tears. In late summer, they took a trip upstate, a small cabin by a lake. Nothing extravagant. Just quiet. Just time. They played board games and burned marshmallows. Took morning walks along the shore. Lucas learned how to skip stones. Naomi read entire books in the hammock. Ethan forgot to check his email for 3 days and didn't feel guilty once. On the last night, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, Naomi and Ethan stood at the edge of the dock, Lucas already asleep inside. Ethan wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. She leaned back into him. "I'm becoming," she said. He kissed her temple. "That's all I could ever want." They didn't get married right away. There were no grand proposals, no sweeping gestures. But one morning, Ethan placed a small velvet box on her nightstand. Not with a question, but with a note. "Whenever you're ready. Not because I need a ceremony, but because I want a lifetime." She didn't open the box immediately. She just looked at him, heart whole, eyes soft, and nodded. Because some things don't need to be said out loud to be heard completely. Love, as it turned out, wasn't in the big declarations or the neatly wrapped endings. It was in shared glances across a messy kitchen, in quiet forgiveness after sharp words, in a child's drawing taped to the fridge, in tea on rainy evenings, in choosing each other over and over, even when the world didn't make it easy. Naomi never imagined this life. Neither had Ethan. But now, they couldn't imagine anything else. Autumn returned to New York with its quiet, melancholic splendor. The kind of season that painted the sidewalks in amber and rust, turning every breeze into a whispered memory. For Naomi, Fall had once felt like ending's warmth, light, and promises that never fully formed. But now, it felt different. It felt like a reflection, like comfort, like the calm exhale that comes after holding your breath too long. The brownstone she shared with Ethan and Lucas sat wrapped in a warm stillness that morning, the kind only weekends could offer. The city buzzed in the distance, but time moved slowly in their little world below. Naomi stood barefoot on the hardwood floor in the living room, arms folded, sipping her coffee. The windows were fogged with breath and warmth from the kitchen, where Ethan pretended to read the newspaper, but watched her every move. Lucas had left a trail of Legos across the hallway, and the doggies. They finally got a dog snored softly by the fireplace. Ordinary, unremarkable. And yet, to Naomi, it was everything. Ethan walked in, gently kissing her temple, and handed her a folded paper. She raised an eyebrow. More contracts? He shook his head. Something better. She unfolded it slowly. It was Lucas's handwriting. A school project. What Makes a Home? By Lucas Whitmore. Home is where someone saves you the last cookie, even though it's the best one. Home is where you fall asleep on the couch and wake up with a blanket you don't remember getting. Home is where you're not scared to cry, or mess up, or be quiet, or be loud. Home is where Naomi sings off-key, and Dad still dances with her anyway. Home is where you're not just loved, you're known. Naomi pressed the page against her chest, blinking back tears. Ethan, ever the man of few words, held her. Because what else was there to say? Love wasn't always about grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes, it was as simple and as profound as knowing someone sees all of you and stays anyway. That night, as golden light filtered through the blinds and the city began to hush itself to sleep, Ethan finally opened the velvet box he had given her months ago. He didn't kneel. He didn't ask. He held it between them and said, "If we do this, I want it to be ours, no press releases, no spotlight, just you, me, Lucas, and the life we chose." Naomi ran her thumb over the ring. A quiet, elegant design. Nothing flashy, but it shimmered with a kind of promise only time could forge. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she placed her hand on his chest and felt the steady rhythm beneath, then nodded. And in that unspoken agreement, everything shifted. Not because they needed a wedding to legitimize their bond, but because they were ready to say, "We built this together." The ceremony was private. A Sunday in early winter. Just a small garden tucked behind an old library, with falling leaves as their guests and soft jazz humming in the background. Lucas wore a tiny suit and held their rings like guarding the crown jewels. Naomi wore cream silk and no veil. Ethan had on his father's cufflinks and looked at her like the entire universe had just aligned in one breath. No vows were written. Instead, they spoke from instinct. Naomi, voice soft and steady, said, "I never believed in destiny, but I believe in choice, and I choose you. Again. Always." Ethan, swallowing emotion, replied, "You taught me how to live a life I didn't know I deserved. You are my second chance, and my first real home." Lucas stood between them, grinning so wide his cheeks ached. And as they kissed, a gust of wind swept through the garden. Some said it was just the weather, but Naomi felt it in her bones. A closing of one chapter, and the opening of another. In the months that followed, life returned to its gentle rhythm. There were still early morning meetings, late-night deadlines, grocery lists forgotten, dishes left in the sink, and the occasional disagreement over thermostat settings. But now, all of it existed within a home that breathed with love. Lucas published his short story at school and dedicated it to the people who gave me more than one home, but made it feel like one heart. Naomi continued writing, not because she had something to prove, but because she had something to say. And now, finally, someone to listen. Ethan learned to leave his phone at the door when he came home, to say I love you in the middle of a sentence, to trust silence, to laugh without guilt. They weren't perfect, but they were present, and that made all the difference. They didn't plan a trip or throw a party on their first anniversary. Instead, they sat on the roof of their brownstone, wrapped in a single blanket, watching the skyline flicker in soft gold. Naomi leaned into him and whispered, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we never met?" Ethan shook his head. "No, because I think life would have found a way to bring you to me, one way or another." She smiled, heart full. Because somewhere in the quiet ache of beginnings, through heartbreak and healing, through fear and forgiveness, they had chosen something rare, a love that didn't demand attention, only intention. And in that simplicity, they found forever. If this story moved you, don't hesitate to share your thoughts below. Every comment helps breathe life into the words we share. Like what you've read? Hit that like button. If you believe in stories where love is quiet but accurate, don't forget to follow our channel, because this is only the beginning of many more.